Hi guys, and welcome back to Specimens Pod. You are listening to part 2 of my conversation with Gerard Geer. Just a very quick reminder that this episode contains conversations around death, human fetuses, and a very brief mention of miscarriage. So without further ado, here is part 2 with Gerard Geer on Specimens Pod.
Sorry, I rambled on a little bit there, but yeah.
It was such a phenomenal tale. There's so many things I'd like to pick you up on, but I just don't know where to start. But you did say one thing that really struck a chord with me. When you talked about not being able to work with native species anymore, you lost the heart for your practice. And I wonder if that's got something to do with Australia and the way that you are protective and receptive to your native flora and fauna. I know that Australia is one of the most biologically diverse countries on the planet, with millions of species of plant and animals, many of which are endemic to Australia. I mean, you've got the koala, echidnas, kangaroos, dingoes, the platypus. You've got all of these incredible animals and plants. I wouldn't be able to name them, but do you think that there is something about not being able to work with native animals anymore that actually goes against you as an Australian?
So my understanding of how the Wildlife Act kind of came to be and how we became so strict about the controls around taxidermy, skeletal articulation, basically possession of wildlife. In the 1960s, from the 1960s on, there was a huge global interest in Australiana. And so, you could, at that time, I don't know if there was any licenses or whatnot. If they were very loose. But basically, there was a huge global demand for taxidermied Australian animals all around the world. And so there was a lot of people going out and poaching and taxidermying and selling animals off all around the world. And so the main example that I can think of, I'm sure there were plenty others, but in Western Australia, we have a beautiful black cockatoo. I don't know if you've ever seen these beautiful birds, but they're jet black. They've got the little white specks around their eyes, and the females have just these immaculate tail feathers that when they spread them out, they've got black bands that run through them, but the most gorgeous bright orange and yellow. So during over the 60s and 70s, their population was just absolutely decimated to the point that they became, I believe, critically endangered. And it was predominantly due to wildlife trade. And so my understanding is that was one of the big things that instigated the creation of the Wildlife Act, which is what controls and regulates how you can legally work with native Australian animals. I feel really positive. I feel very differently about the Wildlife Act and its controls than I did back then. Like my perspective has changed a lot since I had that kind of incident. But yeah, one of the things that frustrates me the most about the way that the Wildlife Act works and the way that I guess the culture, the Australian culture has around the biodiversity. Like, for one, like, it really frustrates me, but people here absolutely hate possums, and I absolutely love them. Little ringtail possums are just my favorite little creatures. I have a tattoo of a brush-tail possum skull on my chest. My partner and I have matching possum skull tattoos. But yeah, we have so many invasive animals here. Cats are absolutely one of the worst, and it's really hard to speak about because obviously every single person in the world has an emotional connection to cats. Everybody absolutely loves cats, but they are one of the biggest threats to biodiversity here, certainly for birds and mammals. But I can't remember, recently there's been a push for new legislation to come into place that will hopefully protect some really threatened small ecosystems. I can't remember the name of the mountain kind of range where it is, but basically Australia has an obsession with brumbies. I think it must be it's probably the Snowy Mountains, but I should double check before I talk too much about it. Yeah. But basically, we have an enormous feral brumby population in New South Wales that are causing havoc on a really small, very fragile ecosystem where it's kind of like marshlands. And yeah, obviously being cloven hoofed animals, Australia doesn't has had no time to adapt to that because we've never had them before the 1700s. And so yeah, the Brumbies in this one particular part of New South Wales are causing havoc to hundreds of different species that are endemic to this really small region where the Brumbies are destroying really rapidly. And the public far too heavily in support of the Brumbies, and they want to protect and keep a destructive feral population because of this weird cultural connection that we've formed to these animals, rather than protecting the threatened endemic species that we have here. So it's a little bit frustrating. It can be quite hard to make changes to protect that diversity. While there are some things in place that are awesome because they restrict how we can interact with the native animals that are here, I feel like there's more that we could be doing to protect them from other things that we've brought here.
So, Gerard, you did avoid persecution and the outcome was positive, but I imagine this must have been a really painful time. Did you take some time out after those events to reevaluate the direction of your work?
Well, to be honest, it was a it was a break for myself. Like I had no idea, I felt like I was losing a part of my identity. For me, at that point in time, it was working with native animals that I'd found on the side of the road was a huge part of who I was. And so all of a sudden finding out that I wasn't able to do that, it was really huge. I didn't know what I wanted to do with myself. I didn't know who I was. So it was a break from myself on a professional level, even though I wasn't really working professionally at that time. It was more of just a passion project. But yeah, I just didn't know what I was going to do. It was a very strange time. So yeah, I was reevaluating a lot of things. I think I had left hairdressing and I decided that I didn't want to go back to it. So I didn't know what I wanted to do as a job. I didn't know what I wanted to do was going to be able to do creatively, because that was just something that I was so passionate about. I don't know if I mentioned it before or went into it, but for me, it was such a big part of what I was doing was working with things that I'd found, and working with things that had been given to me. But because so many of those things were native animals, and those native animals being something that I felt more personally connected to, I didn't feel that switching to something else and working with other animals was going to have the same feeling. I didn't feel like it would have that I would have the same connection to it. So it didn't feel like it would be the same thing. So yeah, it was a really big period of evaluation and reevaluation for myself.
Mhm. And this reevaluation, is this the shift that brought you to diaphonization?
Um, not not on its own, but it was definitely a big part of what led to it. So yeah, so when I got back into making art, and when I started looking at it through that different, slightly more scientific lens of getting more into anatomy, at that point I actually started learning a lot more things. I wound up doing a couple of days of almost like an apprenticeship with an ex Melbourne Museum taxidermist, and so I was learning traditional taxidermy. I didn't really do too much, but I did a handful. I got quite deep into it. I learned some traditional tanning and preservation techniques from some Indigenous people that I met when I was in Central Australia. This was at a separate point from the first time around. But yeah, diaphonization itself, that actually came to me through a really bizarre kind of means. As I said, I was really interested in exploring lots of different preservation techniques, and was doing what I could to learn lots of different skills. But one day I was out fabric shopping with a friend of mine, and she pulled out this roll of secondhand fabric. And unrolled it, and I just could not believe it. Over this fabric was this incredible pattern of all of these beautiful little animals that had been rendered transparent, and the bones were stained purple, and the cartilage was stained blue, and you could see through them, and you could see all of the anatomy, but there was a slight haze where the tissue was, so you could see all of the muscles that had made up the animal. And it was just it blew my mind, and I had no idea what it was. It was literally some pictures on a roll of fabric. But I saw it and I was like, I don't know what that is, but I need to learn how to do it. I need to find out what this is. I need to know. And so we bought the roll of fabric. At the time, my friend and I had was starting a fashion label together, and so we were making clothes, and we wound up making a handful of clothes out of that particular fabric and a handful of others. But from the moment we found that fabric to the time that I learned that there was a name for that technique was probably about a year. My Google search history would have been hilarious because, I was searching frantically for any hints or clues that I could find, invisible animals, transparent animals, and I was typing in all of these different things, but I just couldn't find, for ages, I couldn't find any information on it. And I have no idea how I eventually did find information on it, but eventually one of the random search terms I threw in came up with something, and I learned that it was a technique called diaphonization, or clearing and staining. And when I'd seen it, I'd thought, holy crap, this must be like the most scientifically advanced, modern, amazing thing. And the moment that I knew what it was, I actually learned that the technique itself is over 100 years old, which just blew my mind. The fact that it was comparatively quite an old technique, and I'd never seen it before. I'd never come across it before. It just really blew my mind. And so yeah, basically from that point, I was reading everything I could possibly find on the process. I was, downloading, what do you call them, like scientific papers. I was reading all of these random old research papers on different techniques and trying to figure out what kind of process I'd be able to use, and looking at all of the different ingredients that you need to do it. I was making myself lists of everything and trying to figure out how to get my hands on everything. And yeah, it was a real challenge. But yeah, I was fascinated with it the moment that I saw it and was driven to figure it all out.
I had no idea that it was hundreds of years old. That's remarkable, and it makes me wonder what they were doing diaphanizing specimens 100 years ago. Do you think it was for pathology purposes?
Well, absolutely. So pathology, the pathology is the main reason why diaphonization exists. So basically, the main use of and the main reason that you would diaphonize something as opposed to skeletally articulate it or taxidermy it is that you can diaphonize an incredibly small specimen. So, for example, a developing fetus can be diaphonized before the bones have actually calcified. Whereas if you were to try to clean it up using domestic beetles or different processes to prepare the skeleton, because the bone is cartilaginous and hasn't properly calcified, it's not going to be a very good referent. The other thing that you can do is you can actually watch the development of bone over time. So, for example, let's say that we've got a mouse fetus at every different stage through its gestation process. By dual staining it with the Alcyon blue to stain the cartilaginous tissues, and alizarin red to stain the bone, the calcified bone, that beautiful violet color. If you were to diaphonize and then compare every different stage of that gestation process, you can see how the bones become calcified, how the bones develop in situ. And on top of that, not just being able to see how everything develops across time, you can also see how and where they are and how they move. So, for example, let's say that you wanted to study the morphology of fish jaws in a developing specimen. Not only can you see which parts are cartilaginous, how they calcify over time, but you can also observe the relationship between each of the different bones that make up the fish skull, because when you've diaphonized a specimen, everything remains intact, but it's still soft and flexible. So you'd be able to open and close the mouth, be able to widen out the operculum and see the gills, and see how everything interacts with everything else around it. So yeah, it's phenomenal for studying small detail in situ. It's phenomenal for being able to observe the changes that would happen over time. Yeah, there's a lot of application for it in pathology. But the thing that fascinates me the most about it, I'm not entirely sure how the process of clearing tissue was discovered, but this has always fascinated me. So the stain that binds to calcium was discovered because it actually used to be used as a food dye. So it was an agent that you might mix with some icing and put it on a cake to make a beautiful reddish purple icing. And it used to be used in foods quite often. But it was discovered that this particular dye stained bones because there were pigs that were being fed all of the food waste that had this stain in it, and when those pigs were slaughtered for food, when they were preparing and deboning the meat, when they were cutting the meat off the bone, they discovered that the bones had been dyed purple and that the pig's teeth were purple and the pig's jaw was purple, and so that was how the main stain that's used in diaphonization was discovered through feeding it to pigs.
Unbelievable. I had no idea that the specimen still stays pliable. I imagine it has to stay submerged in a liquid, and you can tell me what that liquid is because it still has organic material and therefore will still decay.
Absolutely. So just to give a bit of a rundown of how the process works, and this will explain why they're in the solution that they're in. So basically, the process of diaphonization, it renders the tissues transparent by basically breaking down the proteins that are in the tissues, leaving nothing but the connective tissue. And I've just gone blank of the name for the little bits of scaffolding that remain. I'm really annoyed that I can't remember the word because it's a great word. But yeah, basically the all of the proteins in the muscle and through the body are removed using a caustic solution of potassium hydroxide, and then once that's all rinsed, the bones are stained, the cartilage is stained, and slowly the muscle tissue is basically infused with increasing concentrations of glycerin. So glycerin is a preservative fluid. It's a sugar-based alcohol. It's very viscous, so it's quite thick. And basically, once the muscle tissue of the specimen that's being diaphonized has a pretty much pure concentration of glycerin in the tissue, it's fully saturated. The cleared muscle tissue has the same optical density as the glycerin solution that it's kept in. So basically what that means is when light moves through the glycerin and then through the muscle tissue, because the densities are the same, the light moves through at the same speed, which is what gives the illusion of transparency. So that's a big part of the reason why they're kept in solution. If you were to keep it in alcohol like methanol, for example, the specimen would look almost white. It wouldn't have that same transparency because there's such a huge difference in the optical density between the cleared muscle tissue and the methanol. So yeah, basically the glycerin acts not only as a preservative, but also as a medium to allow the optical density effect to take place. But you also do use an antifungal preservative in with the glycerin, and that's thymol, and that basically just stops any bacteria or fungals, anything that you don't want from growing in the solution over time.
So forgive me for my ignorance. When I'm thinking, all of the things that you're saying are so informative and you really know your stuff. It's obvious that there is a very heavy chemistry component to this and you're totally geeking out and I'm living for it. Um, but how is it different to something like plasticization? Like you're not resubstituting the liquid content in the specimen with this new preservative, or are you? Just to get a clearer handle on what's actually happening.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's kind of interesting. Like I don't know a lot about plastinization. I've never done it. I have experimented with it and I have tried. So I would say that the main difference would be that, so first of all, plastinization, you definitely could plastinate a diaphonized specimen. Plastinization is the process of replacing all of the fluids within the body with a resin or a plastic that can cure over time to preserve it. So basically, yeah, my understanding is that tissue that has been plastinated actually has there's a particular chemical bond that I believe is replaced with a plastic bond. I'm not 100% sure. I could be very, very wrong. Plastination is definitely not my forte. But the difference between between plastination and diaphonization is with diaphonization, you're definitely infusing the specimen with with the glycerin, but it's not curing or fixing it. The specimen does need to stay in the solution, whereas obviously with plastinization, you can take the specimen out of that solution and it'll cure on its own and stay preserved as it is. Whereas if you were to take a diaphonized specimen out of the solution, it's going to dehydrate over time as the glycerin leaves the tissue.
And this next question is going to be an absolute thorn in your side. I am 100% confident that you get asked this more times than you've had hot dinners. But for the sake of my podcast and all of the people wondering, I'm going to have to ask it. Human diaphonization. Is it possible? Is it legal? Thoughts?
Possible, yes. Legal, depends. I don't know too much about the laws with human preservation in Australia. I know that it's difficult. I know there's a lot of difficulties with it. I have done some human preservation. I articulated a client's toe after he'd had his toe surgically removed, and he was able to keep it. However, I didn't deal with any of the legals. That was all done through, he did that all himself through the hospital that he had it removed from. I'm not 100% sure how one would go about doing it at the moment. Certainly not for somebody like myself who's working independently. I actually do have some friends who work at a human anatomy in the human anatomy department at Melbourne University, and I've been meaning to catch up with them, and probably will once life returns back to normal post-COVID. But they've been trying to diaphonize a human thumb for the anatomy lab. But obviously, because they're a university, they're an educational space, they have access to the remains of bodies that have been donated for science and education. I don't know if it necessarily correlates to an individual on their own. I have spoken to a number of people who've tried to have their bodies donated to individuals in their will, and whether or not they can legally do that is something that I'm not super aware of. I do have a few people who are currently attempting to go through the legal process to have their bodies either in part or in whole donated to me when they do pass away. However, hopefully that's a long way down the road, and the legalities of it are not something that I'm particularly familiar with at all. I do know that it definitely is possible to do human remains, because there's a lot of people in the States where I know that the legislation is a little bit different. I do have a client that I've been speaking with who's based in the States, and this is a bit of I should probably give a trigger warning here. So this is a little bit sensitive. I'm going to be talking about miscarriage, but I do have a client in the States who sadly miscarried at about 4 months, 4 months into term, and she was able to have her miscarried fetus preserved and is currently in her possession. And she's looking at the moment through the processes of how she can legally have it sent from the United States to me in Australia to diaphonize and preserve for her. I've not yet started looking into it because it's a lot of work navigating the legal system from my end, and I'm probably not going to touch it until I know that it's legal for her to send it to me from her end before I look into whether or not I can legally receive it from her, and whether I can actually legally send it back or not. So I'm not too sure about the logistics and the legalities of it in that sense. I know that it can be quite difficult, the legalities of sending human remains across borders depending on how they've been preserved and whatnot. But I have seen a number of really, really beautifully diaphonized human fetuses in the past. I've personally seen some in collections when I was in Thailand, and I've seen lots of photos of them preserved, photos of them on the internet, different collectors around the world. I've seen quite a few, but I've never personally seen one in Australia. However, the question that I get asked most frequently is actually whether or not, if somebody were to donate their body to me once they die, whether I'd be able to diaphonize an adult human. And for me, this is a really interesting one because yes, it is definitely possible. It would be astronomically difficult and incredibly expensive. As a rule with diaphonization, the larger something is, the more challenging it's going to be, the longer it's going to take, and the costs are astronomical. But for me personally, I would imagine if I were to do a full adult human, if I was to diaphonize a full adult human, I would assume that I would need probably at least 20 grand of lab equipment because there'd be some very specific things that I would need to be able to do. I'd need to be able to drain the solutions from the body through each change without potentially upsetting or damaging the it feels weird saying specimen while referring to a human. But that'd be, it's really bizarre. I don't know why it's different. It feels different somehow. But yeah, it would be quite difficult. But for me, the real I'm less interested personally in the physical or the technical processes of doing it. But for me, the thing that's most important to talk about is the long-term processes. For example, if somebody was to want their body diaphonized after they pass away, what happens once it's diaphonized? Do I keep it in my studio? Do I put it somewhere on display? Do I donate it to a university or a museum? Does somebody want to pass it to their children in their will? For me, that I probably wouldn't engage with something like that unless there was a really well thought out long term plan, and ideally with a museum or an education space lined up to receive it long term, because it just don't know what you would do with diaphonized grandpa,
Yeah, it would make a really good room divider, right?
Uh,
um,
absolutely.
I reckon it would be pretty remarkable with the light coming in, early morning sunrise and having the light come through the specimen. I know I agree using the word specimen feels strange, but corpse doesn't feel right
Mm.
either. Um,
Yeah, it's weird how we have different language to speak about humans as we do with animals. I think it again reflects that weird disconnect that we kind of socially, culturally have.
you feel comfortable
But
you feel completely comfortable working on human beings. You wouldn't have a problem with having, a human in your freezer.
I've actually, I'd never really, I always thought that it would be totally fine. So I used to, part of the reason that I feel like I know this for sure is I actually used to work at Melbourne University for a couple of years. It was the best job I ever had. I was a glorified bin guy. I literally drove around in a ute with my mate listening to the radio and moved heavy things and dealt with trash. But one of the weird jobs that I wound up with while I was there, and we totally weren't supposed to do it, but I'm not sure how we wound up doing it. But for a couple of weeks at the Human Anatomy Lab, we wound up actually being the people that were transporting the bodies, the cadavers, from the truck up to the classroom. And I loved that. I absolutely loved it. For me, it was the first time I actually got to go into the Human Anatomy Lab, and the smell of formaldehyde was quite familiar to me because I work with it quite often. But it was very different being able to see all of this preserved human anatomy. And so I felt quite comfortable in there, and I didn't feel particularly put off. I didn't feel very uncomfortable working around human bodies. And so I actually felt like that would be something that I would be quite comfortable with. However, earlier this year, I was a guest speaker at the oh, geez, I can't remember the acronym. What is the term? Uh, funeral workers preservation. Why do I not remember the word? Um,
Embalming.
Embalming, that's what it was. Embalming is the word. So, okay, so earlier this year, I actually was a guest speaker at an international embalming conference where I was basically there talking about a whole bunch of different science things and art things, and talking about the similarities in processes that I use to what embalmers use, and talking about a whole bunch of different techniques. And one of the things that I found really quite interesting was at the moment there's been a really big push for a move towards what are being called water cremations, which is basically where rather than burning a body, which obviously generates a lot of CO2, a lot of energy goes into it, you're burning a lot of gas, cremating the body down to ashes, you instead use a chemical process and water and heat to basically break down the body, and yeah, you still wind up with all of the bones and the remains afterwards, but rather than burning the body, you're chemically processing it with water. And one of the things that I found really fascinating looking into this is that the process is actually really quite similar to diaphonization. Um, but I digress. So at the conference, it was really amazing. I had the opportunity after I spoke to take part in a bit of a hands-on workshop with some plastinators and embalmers to talk about different techniques that they use when preparing bodies for open casket funerals. And so we wound up doing a little bit of a workshop for about maybe 3 hours, I think it was, where basically we were looking at different body parts and learning different ways of identifying veins for injecting embalming fluid, talking about different techniques to create, lifelike, to restore like the puffiness to the lips. And yeah, basically the first thing that I saw when I walked into this room with my little lab coat on, feeling pretty confident that I was, comfortable around working with human remains. There were two semi-dissected, decapitated, preserved heads on the table, and all of a sudden I realized that this was not something that I was entirely prepared for, and I was really, really quite overwhelmed. In the past, I'd previously, like I said, I'd skinned out a human toe, but maybe that was more comfortable to me because I, spoke to the man who the toe belonged to. There was that. It was different somehow. So yeah, I did find it really quite challenging. Towards the end of the day, I was a lot more comfortable with it, but I was definitely not as comfortable with it as I might have expected to have been. So yeah, I do think it would be quite different doing an entire human body. I think it would be very different to what I'm what I'm used to doing.
Mhm. Do you think that your work, like pet memorial work, has a memento mori quality to it? Because we're talking a lot about preservation, we're talking a lot about these keepsakes, keeping an animal in a pathology sense or returning it to its owner. If you're asked to do maybe a small gecko or a lizard or something, are you doing it with a kind of consciousness about memento mori and upholding notions of celebrating mortality or anything like that?
Well, absolutely. So, I think a big part of my work actually is doing pet commissions and pet memorials. So I'd say that on average, I probably do maybe one to two. I probably take on one to two pet commission jobs every month. So yeah, there is a huge aspect of the memento mori to my work. So I have a handful of animals that have been donated to me to make sculptural artworks with, because maybe the people that have donated them to me don't necessarily want the pet back, but they want their remains to be preserved and honoured in a different way. When it comes to the pet preservation work, I've probably been doing that for almost 10 years now, whether it be full articulations or, once upon a time I was doing pet taxidermy. I only really did it for a couple of birds, and to be honest, I feel a bit bad about doing it to those poor birds because my taxidermy skills are terrible. But more than anything, I think in the beginning I was probably doing more memento pieces, so maybe making something wearable out of some of the bones or preserving a small piece of the skin for somebody. These days, I'm doing a lot more naturalistic articulation or diaphonization. But yeah, there really is a big personal aspect to it that's involved. Like, I think for me, it's really important to try to get a bit of a feel for what the animal was like in life. So whether that be learning a little bit about the animal and their personality from the owners, as well as trying to get as many photos as I can that show them in different positions and different poses, to try to, as much as I can, capture the life and the movement and the poses the postures that animal might have held in life. But more broadly speaking about my sculptural work, I think the memento mori aspect of that to my work is maybe more, how do I put it? So for me, I don't know most of the pieces that I make, and the sculptural pieces that I make. I don't really know the animals that have gone into them. By the time I've cleaned the bones and prepared them, I often don't necessarily know which specific animal that was. So, for example, I get a lot of animals from a handful of different vets. I get them from a handful of different universities as post-education specimens. So the personal aspect of that is maybe not really there so much in my sculptural works. However, I do think that a big part of what I'm doing is, kind of trying to create something that's beautiful out of the animal remains as a reminder that, the most. I don't think that I'm. I don't think that that's a main thematic thing that I'm doing with my work. Obviously, death and mortality are a really, really huge part of my work, but my work isn't designed, my sculptural works, there's no intention to remind people that life and death exists. That's not really a huge part of my creative motivations. For me, the motivation is less to remind and comfort people about death, but more to create a window that allows people to see the beauty that can live on beyond that. So I don't know, maybe it does tie into some aspects of Memento Mori, but yeah, my work is less about death and mortality and more about the beauty of anatomy.
Gerard, there are people who have listened to this pod and are now wondering where your specimens are coming from. Are they coming from zoos? Now you're not working on native species. Where are the animals coming from?
Yeah, so well, pretty much all of the specimens that I work with are donated to me these days. It's very rare that I'll find something and pick it up off the side of the road anymore. Partly because it's kind of easier for me to utilize the sources that I've built through connections with lots of people over the last 10 or 15 years or so. So yeah, the vast majority of the specimens that I work with come from either vets. So I have a lot of vet friends who will keep animals that they've had to euthanize for me. All of the non-natives that have come in, I get a lot of kittens from shelters that have been euthanized. I may or may not have mentioned before that we have a very big feral cat population here, and the shelters are incredibly overcrowded. And so the sad reality is that there are thousands and thousands of kittens and cats that are euthanized in shelters around Australia every year. And so I do source a lot of animals through spaces like that. I get a lot of post-education animals. So from a number of different universities, I'll get animals that have been used for different research, for dissection classes. I get a lot of, pretty much all of my fish come from the natural deaths from the aquarium trade. I have contacts that breed animals, so I might get occasional stillborns. Yeah, basically, for me, I guess, ethos around how I source and where I get animals from is that personally, I don't want to contribute to any industries that cause death. So, for example, I personally don't really like the term byproduct. People often talk about this when speaking about byproducts of the fur industry. My perspective is that if you're purchasing byproducts from the fur industry, if you're purchasing them, they're not a byproduct, they're a product. And so I try not to support that. I try to work with animals that have either died of natural causes, been euthanized for humane reasons. The animals that I get that come from kind of post research, there's often, I guess, ethical issues around that because a lot of people have different perspectives. But for me personally, I believe that if there've been, first of all, a lot of groundbreaking research that has caused a lot of positive good has come from the unfortunate necessity of animal testing, particularly with the pharmaceutical industry. So I feel the moral good that comes out of that outweighs the ethical ungood of how they handle of how animals are used in that space. But more than anything, for me, the fact of the matter is that after animals have gone through those stages, if I don't collect them and use them for my work, more often than not, they just go to landfill. So for me, it's far better that something beautiful comes from them at the end of the day, and as much of their remains as possible go back into the natural cycle. The flesh feeds my beetles, the beetle poop feeds my veggie garden then feeds me, and then I get to make some cool art out of the bones. So I feel like it creates a really beautiful kind of like little closed circle. So I used to take issue with the idea of using animals that had been hunted or deliberately killed. These days, I feel much more ethically comfortable with it, provided that they've been culled humanely and they've been culled for either humane reasons or the reasons for environmental protection. So, for example, I get large amounts of cane toads shipped down to me from Queensland, where cane toads are incredibly destructive and invasive, where they're captured and culled humanely by researchers and people through a lot of different fields for the purposes of, by biological preservation, I guess, and ecological preservation and protection. Same with foxes and rabbits. Obviously, they're a huge problem here. Feral cats, to some extent, feral dogs. While hunting is not something that I'm particularly, I certainly don't hunt, and it's not something that it's not I guess, industry that I'm a part of. I don't think that it's an issue for hunting invasive species. It is difficult, but there are a lot of things that I consider when it comes to sourcing animals. I try to ensure that the animals that I work with have been, at the very least, if they've been euthanized humanely, and for reasons that fit with my own personal ethos.
Yeah. Well, it's beautiful, and I think you're right. As long as there is a ethical objective, which is what your work's really about. At the end of the day, you're trying to preserve these beautiful specimens and give them, repurpose them and give them amazing life. So why you wouldn't do that for other specimens, it wouldn't make sense. It's very, like, you use the word cyclical around your work, and I think that you have the perfect cycle. Gerard, do you see yourself as an educator? I know you have done some work in the education sector. Do you have any experiences that you can share with me about your work as an educator?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. I've been teaching workshops and skills, the different skills that are under my bizarre umbrella in a lot of different forms and methods over the last maybe 10 or 12 years. The first handful of workshops that I ran were really bizarre and really fun. I was actually teaching roadkill recycling workshops at what we call bush doofs, which are music festivals in Australia. So usually day 3 or day 4 of a big festival party, teaching people how to preserve roadkill with bare basic tools on the side of the road. So teaching basically roadside taxidermy and bone preservation techniques to a handful of cooked trippers on day 4 of a of a rave. So that was the early beginnings of my educative career. From there, I moved on and was doing a whole bunch of different things. So I was teaching different methods of identifying roadkill for food. So I was teaching people how to effectively live off the land while you were traveling, different methods of identifying whether or not something that you find on the side of the road is edible or whatnot. Going back to the ethos, there was a period for about 2 or 3 years where I went pretty well full freegan. So I wasn't buying meat or animal products in any way, shape, or form, and the only meat that I was eating was animals that I'd found already dead. And so I was teaching that for a little while and teaching people different ways of identifying food. From there, I started teaching naturalistic articulation workshops, and that was a bit more of a heavy science focus. And then, yeah, maybe, when would it have been? I think 2016, 2015. Yeah, at the end of 2015, I wound up, I spent 3.5 months living in a really beautiful remote Indigenous community on Elka Island called Galiwinku. And while I was up there, I was I basically ran a well-being program where I was working with the disability unit, doing just awesome, really, really fun projects with the coolest bunch of kids, 5 days a week, doing hair, doing dress ups, just playing games and having a whole bunch of fun. But in and amongst that, while I was up there, I also wound up doing some really fun comparative anatomy classes with the kids from grade 1, 2, and 3. So yeah, that was a really, really fun thing to do. So I actually took up a handful of skeletons with me, some pre-cleaned bones, some disarticulated skeletons. And while I was up there, we wrote a, how do I put it? Yeah, so for about 3.5 months back in the end of 2015, yeah, I went and moved up to Elle Kaye Island, which is a really beautiful, small, remote community that just off the northeastern most point of Arnhem Land up in the Northern Territory. And yeah, so while I was up there, I was working at the local primary school, running a wellbeing program with a whole bunch of really, really amazing little kids. And then a couple of days a week, maybe one day every couple of weeks, I was also doing some really fun interactive comparative anatomy classes with the grade ones, twos, and threes, which was really fun. Basically, I took a handful of mice skeletons and got to pass them around to all the kids so they could have a little look at the bones, and talking about how the anatomy of a mouse is actually really quite similar to our anatomy, and kind of pointing out the differences and the similarities that we share, even though we're such completely different kinds of animals. Our skeletal anatomy is in a lot of ways very, very similar. On top of that, while I was there, I also collaborated with an amazing photographer and designer, and we wrote a really awesome little anatomy book about the nick, which is the Yungamatha word for rat. Where we basically took a whole bunch of photos of the different parts of it and put it all back together. And we had both the English and the Yungamatha translations for all of the different anatomical parts and pieces. And so that was published into a little education book, which is, yeah, the grade ones and twos used for learning up in Elle Kaye Island, which was, yeah, really, really awesome.
That's gorgeous. How lovely that your work is informing the science education of little ones.
I yeah, it's a pretty cool feeling. So yeah, at the moment I'm actually writing a handful more classes, and hopefully in the new year I'll be teaching a really broad new range of different skill sets under my bizarre little umbrella. So carrying on the teaching.
Well, that brings me really nicely to my second last question. Do you see yourself as an educator, an artist, a chemist, or a scientist, or are you all of these in order to be who you are today?
I kind of think all of them. I mean, how I define myself and what I do changes pretty regularly, but basically, all of the things listed are things that I'm really passionate about. I really love teaching and sharing the skill set that I have because, for me, when I started in pretty much every skill set that I practice, when I started learning it, I learned it all by myself. I learned a lot through trial and error, through a hell of a lot of research, but more than anything, I learned what I know through making mistakes and then figuring out why those mistakes happened and how to avoid them in the future. And so for me, education is really something that I'm really passionate about because I get to share that process with other people and help them to avoid the mistakes and the pitfalls that I'd made along the way. But also I just get to nerd out with people who are passionate about things that I'm passionate about. And that's a really awesome feeling, for such a long period of my life. The passions that I have were something that I couldn't really share with many people because a lot of my friends and the people around me didn't necessarily either have the same interests or passions or have the desire to listen or talk about it. So yeah, I really love being able to share and teach for that reason because connecting with like-minded people is an awesome feeling.
Yeah,
So
yeah. And it's amazing. You've just
yeah.
done a full 360 and that was very, very intelligent of you to bring up the very first answer to the first question I had about you being a kid. And we finished nicely on that one. Um, yeah, it was deliberate, of course.
Complete accident.
Gerard, my final question to you today is what does your future look like? Is there anything that you want to achieve that you haven't yet with your work or on a more personal note that you are yet to?
Okay, well, achieve. I don't really know. For me, like it's been really bizarre, like realizing, that over the last couple of years I've been able to fully support myself doing something that I absolutely love. It's a really cool feeling. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like in terms of what I want to do and what I want to achieve, I want to broaden out the skill set. I want to develop my skill set and get better and better and better at what I'm doing. Whether I want to pick up new skills, I'm not too sure where that direction's going, but I kind of feel like I want to dabble a little bit more into the plastination experiments that I was doing last year and see if I can refine some of those techniques a little bit more. But more broadly, like my plans for at the very, short-term goals my plans for next year, I'm hoping to be able to set up a new space for teaching and education, where I can teach a broader range of interesting and diverse skill sets that I practice and share that with more people. So I'm really, really working hard to make that happen at the moment. I've got a couple of exhibitions coming up that I've really got to get cracking on. My next solo show is in July of next year, so I've got a little bit of time to work on that. I'm still playing around with a few ideas that I've got to refine. And then at the end of the year, I've got another really awesome collaborative exhibition planned that I've got to keep my little lips sealed on for the time being, so I can't give you any clues about what that is. But beyond that, I don't know. I'm really liking the direction that my creativity and my processes are going at the moment, and I think that I just want to make more of it happen. I don't know.
Well, thank you so much, Gerard, for being on my podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Elle. Well, yeah, no, honestly, thanks for having me on. It's been really, really nice to chat with you. So I had a blast.
So there you have it, 2 hours with Gerard Geer discussing everything under the sun, I think. Thank you so much to Gerard. It was a fantastic interview. I had so much fun. It was a little crazy that it went on for so long, but it just goes to show that he has so much to talk about and is so interesting. So thank you to Gerard for staying up super late and talking into the night with me about all the things he's passionate about. If you'd like to find Gerard, he's all over the internet. His handle is at articulated imagination on Instagram with an underscore between each word. So that's at articulated underscore imagination. He's on Facebook under the same handle, and I'm on Instagram at Elle Kaye Taxidermy. The podcast is at Specimens Pod. This podcast is edited and produced by me, your host, and the music is by Harrison Amir and is called Giraffes, which seems rather fitting as we talk a lot about animals on this show. Continue to take care of yourselves, and if you're in lockdown, I hope this has been 2 hours of pure escapism and you may have learned something new. I will see you in a fortnight for episode 6. Lots of love.